ask everyone to close their laptops unless they're looking things up or quickly taking notes, because I spend a lot of time thinking about what to tell you, how to tell you, so I just want you to have the full attention. And also, just on a practical sense, there's a very specific skill that's going to help you in your career, which is to appear as if you actually care. So you might be in a meeting in a lot of work situations where like you're just not interested, but like that performing of like looking like you're actually paying attention is a really great skill. So let's practice that. Just half kidding. Okay, so modularization in UNIX and social stratification in Denver is the topic of today. The summary is I'm going to talk about Dante's Hell, which is Dante's Divine Comedy, which I briefly mentioned the other class. I'll use that as a metaphor to talk about social stratification. And I want to talk about this idea of a forever war. So modularity, what the hell is modularity? It's essentially breaking big problem into smaller, manageable pieces. So it's easier to change without affecting the entirety or the other modules. One of the key things about modularity that I think computer scientists and your game developer majors really know about is that it's essential to scale. It's also essential to be paired up with this idea of abstraction. So abstraction aims to give these smaller pieces of modules certain boundaries, meaning that one piece of the function is independent from another, and it can feed into another modules nicely. So this modularity and abstraction go hand in hand. So you can't really have one without the other. Yeah, modularity without abstraction would be a little bit chaotic, and you see that in a lot of the cases where there's intention to build structures, but it actually becomes more of a clustered chaoses. This is just a diagram from technical explanation of modularity. I am not so interested in specifics of this diagram, but I do want to show you the hierarchy and architecture of modularity and a couple of ideas that will come into play in the future, which is that each module has functions, and it's multiple functions. It's more than 1, 2, 3, sometimes thousands of functions. So it allows us to neatly keep larger programs into smaller bits that are talking to each other. So there's this idea of a cohesion and coupling. Anyone know what is the meaning of a cohesion in modular programming? Cohesion means that it's a measurement of the strength in the relationship between various functions within the module, if that makes sense. So there's like functional cohesion, sequential cohesion, communication cohesion, other kinds of things. And coupling is a measure of a strength in relationship between various modules within software. So it's like the relationship between the different modules. A good software design requires high cohesion and low coupling. Does that make sense? So we want more over there, less in the coupling. So that's the idea of a module, is that it's self-contained, and one part of the system do not know the details of the other part of the software. That makes sense, right? We kind of come back to this drawing, which I showed you very early on in the first class. I actually hand drew a version of this, and I showed you, and I want to come back to this. So in every kinds of computation, I believe everyone would actually agree at the bottom of the layers of abstraction is physics. All computation is physical. Every kind of cloud computing, AI computing, is transistors that are ticking, right? So we cannot get away from physics, at least to now. So there's transistors, there's logic gates, registers, microarchitecture that becomes the bedrock for instruction set architecture. And this is where it's really interesting of like that middle ground between hardware and software is right here. And then we have these platforms to have machine code, assembly, programming language that becomes tools for algorithm, and we have applications like Microsoft Word or Keynote or Facebook. So as we go up, it increases on the level of abstraction. And as it goes down, it increases on the level of complexity. So most of you, most computer scientists today would not write machine code, right? That's just zeros and ones, and it's just brutal. But people in the 1950s were like, you have to write in machine code. There are some older folks like that. But you might learn assembly. You might learn some of the kind of foundational stuff if you're going deep into computational sciences. But in a lot of cases, most programmers are working on the top layer between the programming languages and applications. So we live on top of these levels of abstraction. Here is more of a three-dimensional diagram that's essentially the same thing. But I wanted to show you this more on a perspective to just give you just one possible way that how these levels of abstraction could work together. So at the bottom, there's a silicon that has FPGA, which is a field programmable gate array, which is essentially kind of like this empty lot that you can fill to build computational modules. Or you could have a microprocessors, and you could have a Java virtual machine that runs different kinds of bytecode programs that becomes Java program, that becomes Linux practices, and etc. So all these levels of abstraction between silicon chips, executable to program to the task level module. Social stratification it refers to a society's categorization of its people into groups based on socioeconomic factors like wealth, income, race, education, ethnic, gender, occupation, social status, or derived power, which means like social and political power that you have access to. So hierarchies within each group ascribe them different levels of privileges. So at the bottom, it says, we feed all. There are workers. There are people who say, we work for all. Also, these are the group that are mostly invested in revolting against the status quo. And then there's the leisure class that says, we eat for you, which is the people who enjoy the entertainment and luxury. And then there's people who say, we shoot at you, which is the military dictatorship. And there's the religious class, which is called, we fool you. And at the top, there's the powerful class that says, we rule you. And all of them are supporting this idea of capitalism. Anyone seen images like this before? Some, yeah, a little dark, but I think obviously this is something that you know in a capitalist society. An idea of education is that it should allow people to climb up the ladder of the system. Idea of democracy is that everybody has a vote. This should allow most group of people to become the middle class that can have access to some of the wealth and power. So Dante's hell is, I'm going to come back to it a few times, but essentially it's this idea of a journey through hell to purgatory, to heaven, that Dante takes us, that is supposed to represent two things. The one, which is sort of the prototype of how religious ideologies were understanding the idea of ethics, right? The good, bad, and sort of the consequences of those moral behaviors. And two, it was actually a portrayal of Florence in 14th century. So Dante actually brought in a lot of people that he liked or did not like. So those figures in the Inferno are real people who were either politicians or religious people who Dante had opinions about. So it's both very real and ideological. Yeah, so this is one rendering of the hell. So that's just the introduction about the topic of modularization and social stratification. And I want to bring it back to Tara McPherson's writing, which is the essay that we have spent the most time on. So again, this topic is the US operating systems at mid-century and intertwining of race and UNIX. So if you disagree with this essay, I know many of you did, that's precisely the point. That is precisely the point. So I am actually happy that you disagree with some of the core elements, because this allows us to talk about it. I want to talk about why you disagree. The essay is essentially a meditation on the segregation of social sciences from STEM. It's this idea that she's bringing this issue that we're teaching a generation of computer scientists and engineers without very much or at all understanding of the social consequences and the ethical dilemma of STEM. So it's, if you're a CS or game dev and major, you are part of the system that she's critiquing. And she knows that you disagree with her arguments. Because you and I, all of us, are product of modularization, and specifically academic modularization. This divide between sciences and arts and humanities is relatively recent. Back in Greek days or even Renaissance days, like engineers were artists and vice versa. But this hyper-specific discipline is more of a modern invention. So she's actually just saying like, hey guys, like we could actually talk about both. Like we don't need to position ourselves as only an engineer or a social scientist. So I agree with your disagreements in 3 parts. And I refute and disagree with your disagreements in 3 parts. And I'm going to get through that. Lastly, I propose another way of thinking about modularization, which is the last part and which I'm going to spend some of Wednesday as well. So 3 things that I agree with. I agree that modularization existed before UNIX, and it is natural and historical phenomena. I think you would agree with that. So let's take a look at nature. This is a photo of lichen, which is somewhere between moss and fungus. It's a very weird thing. It's actually not a living organism, or it's more of a kind of a symbiotic relationship between non-living and a living organism. So it's very weird how it actually exists. And you see them in dead trees or parks, and you would not notice how important they are, but they actually keep the forest in a very ecological, sustainable way. So those are the kind of things that have a modular entities that proliferate in nature and give back to nature that we don't really notice. And it's not really like plant or flower. It's just spread out in a very weird way that I have a hard time describing. I really want you to research or learn about these, but that's modular. And the second part is the historical nature of modularization. So Dante takes us through layers of abstraction. So this is the first image in Dante's book where he's inviting the readers to follow him a journey through the dark forest to go to the hell, essentially. So Dante takes us through layers of abstraction, and modularization and segregation has been consistent as far as history of humanity. So it's not a new thing. This is just another more of a medieval rendering of Dante's Hell. And you can see that it's actually just the inverse of the diagram of social stratification that I showed you, but essentially the same thing of kind of different layers representing different sins and different kinds of struggles. There are a lot of the Christian value system in Dante's Hell that needs to be separated from the social critique of the time. So it's presenting the hell as literal kind of a space that you're going to fall into if you commit these sins. But it's also very precise depiction of the different kind of the exploitation and kind of a violence that were being enacted in the society of that time. 2, I agree modularization itself may not be the problem. It actually embodies some beautiful philosophies. So pipe is one command in UNIX kind of command line that is often used that Tara McPherson mentions briefly. But I want to say that it's actually a really beautiful concept because it takes output of a program and then feed it into input of another program, which I think a lot of you know. Here's just a diagram of one way of how pipe can be used between a parent and child program. So this allows us to essentially become software that does not confuse itself, and also it's a very fair control of the fair balance between control and command, if that makes sense. So it's almost like the pipe is allowing us, any program, to become able to create an output that another program could take as an input. Radically democratic, right? So I think that's a very powerful concept that allows modularity, but also very different way of thinking about systems and hierarchies, if that makes sense. And practically speaking, it just allows for essentially like, in a very busy like street, you'd need a roundabout, or you need some kind of a road sign to tell the cars to go to one place. So you can't have cars all going at the same time. You need to stop and go. So green light, red light. So that's a beautiful concept. We need that in a large society. I agree that a lot of good things came out of UNIX and advanced computing at large. UNIX, here's just an example of like many kind of computing software. So I would agree that, you know, Google search engine brought amazing things for people in the global south who don't have access to libraries or medical resources. Like they can look up what to do if your child has a fever, right? So amazing things have happened. But I want to watch out for this concept of consequentialism. Anyone know what that means? Consequentialism? Yeah?
It's when like the results of your actions are more significant the actions themselves.
Exactly. So like Colin said, it's one of those concepts where like the end justifies the means. So just because something good came out doesn't always mean the process was good. So these are three things that I agree. Three things that I don't agree. I refute the idea that UNIX and computing is purely scientific field. And this is because every kind of technology is created by human beings, and human beings are always cultural. So these are two of the people who initially started what became UNIX in the future, but they had certain kinds of personal histories, they had certain kinds of values, they had access to technology, and that really shaped how these software were created and became popular. As mentioned in Tara's writing, it was also a time of radical transformation in society. So there were hippies, there was anti-war movement, there were these kind of discovery of psychedelics, which was a huge to really expand what people see as a human cognition. So this book is from a book called Whole Earth Catalog. Anyone heard about that? So it's kind of a, you might run into it in a used bookstore. Whole Earth Catalog was essentially what people imagined as internet before internet became a thing. So it was a magazine, a book that you could buy for like $2, you could mail, and then it just had all the information you need, theoretically. It had information about how to build your home, how to make, you know, solar power, whatever. So it was like this information of information. It was a print magazine, and it was very popular. And it had this idea that if anyone has the tools, they should be able to build anything, which is a very DIY approach. So let's talk about specific philosophy of UNIX, because some of you said like, oh, the author does not understand UNIX, so whatever. But I think what she's saying is both the technical specificity of UNIX, but the philosophy. There is actually a philosophy written around UNIX. Essentially, it's three things. Write a program that does one thing and do it well. There's this kind of a derogative term called like keep it simple, stupid. So I think that you heard that before, but that's essentially what this is. Write programs to work together. So that's about the modularity and connections. Write programs that handle text streams because this is a universal interface. So still very much heavily in the textual encoded information. A little bit more is that there's 17 rules of Unix that I want to just show a couple of things. To build modular programs, write readable programs, use composition, separate mechanisms from policy, write simple programs, write small programs, write transparent programs. And this point is actually kind of interesting that transparency was valued, but it wasn't really executed in the same way that they hoped for. Write robust program, make data complicated when required, not the program. Build on potential users' expected knowledge. And this part is actually one of the key things. So Unix and these kinds of programming assumes you know certain things, that you behave in certain things that are based on the community of people who are building it at the same time. So there, if you look at specific codes, there are kind of like 1960s and 70s jargons. There's like a lot of nerd jokes. There's a lot of like, kind of like things that do not make sense now, but it makes sense to them. So when we inherit these systems, we have to understand these expected knowledge about language, culture, technology. I refute the idea that Unix and the big tech and other modern institutions are too big to fail. And I struggle with this because I go back and forth about this because specifically Unix, I think we're never going to get rid of Unix, even in the age of AI 50 years from now, just because a lot of the hardware that we've inherited are built on that, and just because a lot of knowledge production is built on that. I do think, on the other hand, big tech are not too big to fail. Those are two separate questions, but the mechanics of the technology may not change as much, but I think the culture around the tech might change, or might need to change. And last thing that I disagree with you is that I refute the idea that environmental, racial, gender, economic justice are separate issues. Because I notice a lot of the people who are like, I care about the environment, but I really do not want to talk about racism or gender issues. I feel like that's not my thing. I don't have knowledge for that. I'm a white guy. I don't know what to say about racism. I just don't want to deal with that. So this is a kind of effect of modularization that we're trying to challenge. All of these are always interconnected. I propose to consider smaller scale and slower speeds of computing. So this is a proposal for you to think about, and I'll get to that much more in depth. A lot of the issues of modularization is issue of scale and speed. So it's not necessarily inherently the modular itself, but how it's used to create global economy or large-scale computing. So can we think about smaller and slower computing? And can we think about degrowing the technology from within? A lot of the modules are essentially built to grow infinitely, but it's just reaching certain limits, physical limits now. And can we think about degrowing, de-escalating, kind of really thinking about slower forms of technology? So that's the end of introduction. It's already been like some time. So I just want to ask any questions or thoughts before I move forward. I'm going to talk about social stratification of Denver and DU, and this is going to get a little uncomfortable, so bear with me. But I want to do this so that you understand how to put this into theory, how to put the theory into practice, and also how to see your surrounding more critically. By the way, as you know, I'm a visiting professor, so I'm leaving next week, actually this week. And I was here for 9 months. Previously, I was hired at New York University. I worked mostly in East Coast, and I worked at Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea. And DU was, it was a perfect time to be here, and so my observation is very fresh. So just know that I can say things as a naive person, but also somebody who is not searching for a tenure track position at DU, because that would make my life very different. So let's talk about racial segregation of Denver. So we are like right here. And we are definitely in a white neighborhood. The yellows are the Hispanic neighborhoods, which are between these area and then the Lakewood, and also near Aurora. There's a lot of Asian and Hispanic neighborhoods. Some black neighborhoods. It's interesting, like right next to where I live, there's actually a huge black neighborhood. And near the airport, there's a lot of people in the service industry who are people of color. But essentially, Denver is an incredibly segregated city. Historically, it has been, and it continues to be. Let's take back the history a little bit. Everybody know John Evans, right? The person who made DU. You know the history of him, right? A little bit, but I'll just tell you a little bit more. How did he become rich? In quick sense, a few things, but he was part of the industry that connected the railroad between the Midwest to the West Coast. So one of those turn of the century giants in industry. So this says, he was part of the Denver Pacific Railway, and it connected the first railroad to the Pacific. And I think, as you know, like he was central to the condition of the massacre of the indigenous people in the region. So DU and I think it's Northwestern that he founded, that they are very diplomatic about how they talk about the past, but essentially it is just true that he may not have ordered directly to kill the indigenous people, but he created the conditions for that to happen, and he acted in a way that tolerated that, and he was later responsible for that even in his time. So it's one of those things that his hands are not painted with blood, but I think his infrastructure was part of that. So these are some of the drawings from the Sandy Creek, 1875, sort of what happened from their perspective, some modern rendering and readings from that. And conflicts between the indigenous and the white settlers existed for a long time. This is not the only massacre that has happened, but I think the difference was that the US Army at the time was deployed for these actions. So the difference between individual conflict to a more state-sponsored action against the indigenous people. And it's just a really sad reality because it could have been different. It could have been more collaborative. It could have coexisted. But the land at Sandy Creek today is just vacant. And this particular land that we're sitting in was actually indigenous land. This is just a really prime real estate, like just geographically. So this also was an erasure of indigenous people in the land that we sit on. So one of the largest mountain in Colorado is named after him, but they're also changing it to Mount Blue Sky as a form of reparation. You might wonder, like changing names of the mountains or the street, does that amount to anything? And it actually does, because it leads to history to be changed. So the main street right over here is called Evans Street. So there are people trying to change that, but the school is very reluctant to change that. So that's a bit of a history. But as you know, the segregation is very real here. DU is a white school. It's a very white space. And the custodians are primarily people of color. And Denver and Colorado is heavily segregated. This is from the DU website. So I would say about 70% are white students. And there's about about 11% Hispanic, but other groups are very small in comparison. So University of Denver is a segregated, modularized space. And how does that segregation take place, in my view? It takes place via time allocation, right? I'm not sure if you thought about that. So I teach until 8:50 p.m. on Mondays and Wednesdays. So the custodian workers come in around 9 p.m. So you actually don't see a lot of them if you're only here the daytime, but they are here when we are not here. So the same space, this amazing facility, is maintained by mostly Hispanic, Latino custodian workers. And as you know, the custodians have been in between these contracts, and they're losing their previous employer and becoming part of the larger non-unionized task force that is same as the cafeteria workers. And they're going to lose a lot of the key benefits of working in places like DU, which was the access to take classes here for the future. So their family, their children were able to come to DU, but now no longer. So this kind of a separation of people and the wealth and access that we have and to the custodians is segregation. And this is actually a really serious issue that you should really think about. So again, social stratification is a categorization of its people into ranks based on factors like wealth, income, education, family, background, and power. This is from 2022, I believe, when a few black professors left DU citing campus climate. And this might have been during your time or before your time, but this was a significant event that needs to be studied and really examined. I do not know exactly what have happened, but this is after the BLM protest, and I think many of those black faculties were frustrated, to say the least, but felt it was necessary that they cannot teach here anymore. So it's only less than 3% black faculties at DU. So losing 4 or 5 is actually pretty significant in a very small school like this. And I think you might got this email from the DU leadership about dismantling or this closure of the student encampment for Free Palestine. They sent a few emails really in a rushed format over the few days, but I want to point out this particular sentence. They were saying, we share that the university would not meet their demands for practical and policy-guided reasons. The protests, in turn, shared the deep dedication and passion for the causes that brought them together in the first place. So they're saying like they're just not going to meet any of the demands and very shamelessly saying that without empathy. And I just think it's just jarring, to say the least, and honestly very disappointing. So we live in Dante's hell, in my opinion. We live in a hell that's segregated, where we in the Paradiso do not really see. We do not see what's happening in the hell because it's segregated. So as much as the modern societies are progressing and advanced, we replicate the pre-modern feudal societies. And specifically, I want to ask this question of whiteness. And it gets a little uncomfortable here. Whiteness is a shade of privilege that light-skinned people experience in varying degrees. So whiteness is definitely this tone of skin that people who are from European descent hold. But it's also adjacency to the whiteness, meaning that African person with light skin has access to privilege. Asian person with lighter skin has a privilege. Even like Mexican person with lighter skin has a privilege. And Jewish person has access to whiteness that, although they're not typically, historically considered as a white person, they have adjacency to that privilege. Denver is the whitest place I ever lived. My first-hand observation and interaction of financial disparity between white people needs to be talked about. So I want to get into the shades of whiteness. It's too simplistic to say that white people are privileged because there are many shades of privileges between them. The white working class are experiencing joblessness, addiction, and homelessness, which negatively manifests with negative manifestation of Christianity and white nationalism. So this is rather recent that I would say this is in the last 40, 30 years, this group of the forgotten majority of the people who feel like they do not have access to their privilege, which is kind of given to them by default for being white. And I want to just note about the Christianity and nationalism, because I think that plays a huge role in shaping of the culture dynamic for now and for the future. So Trump is a problem, but I see Trump more as a symptom of these conditions of helplessness and hatred, other than the reason for that. And this forgotten minority feel hatred towards POC, illegal immigrants, quote unquote, and also the elites. The anti-intellectualism and segregationist tendencies lead to stratification of society. And the growing economic disparity between white people is one of the reasons for these growing conservative extremism. So the movements for making America great again undo the social progress and integration that were achieved in the last century and return America to the state of segregation. So this regression of American society back to 1950s and 60s is the movement that we're witnessing right now. The result is a modular society, which each modules are independent, opaque, and disconnected. And I think that we witnessed that in the EU, we witnessed it in America, we witnessed that around the world. So one other question that I had for you for the midterm quiz was like, how do you relate to mid-century activism to contemporary society? And many of you wrote about BLM 2020, because that was a significant moment. I'm sure that changed how you think about the society, and it's still very recent. Now, I want to pivot from my examination of DU in Denver to BLM and that particular moment and problems of that. So this is a man who killed George Floyd. And anyone read like news about how he is right now? He's in prison for 20 years. He's found guilty. He's been stabbed about 20 times by other inmates. So he's one of those people who gets really hard time in the prison. He survived, he's okay, but he is literally in hell, you know. So is he racist? Yeah, I would think so. Was he doing his job? Yeah. And that's the problem. That modularization of him using the full extent of his privilege as a police officer, but still having a racist ideology, and putting those two in action is the problem. I'm just going to show you photos of his bosses, so who testified against him. That's one boss, that's another boss, that's another boss, that's another boss. And they said a lot of things essentially to save their seat, but also to make him as a bad apple, to say that the whole system is not rigged, it's just that him is the individual actor. And I would actually agree that is wrong. I think he is as much of the problem as the system in which that he was able to have a career as a police officer for decades. This is just an organizational chart of the Minneapolis Police Department. And you can see the different sectors are divided into modules. And there's a difference between the purple being the sworn officer, and the brown being the civilian, and then blue being civilian support outside of the Minneapolis Police Department. So purple are the sworn officers. Here is an example of modular system that should change. And I think somebody mentioned in class or in the essay about police systems in other countries. So France is an interesting example where they have different kinds of police and patrol. So there are people who are skilled in de-escalating a situation, moderating conflicts, as opposed to pulling gun at you. So when that doesn't happen, people with more arms show up. So there's levels of things that happen. But in the United States, as you know, it's like from 0 to 100 degree in 2 seconds. So it's just like that mediation does not exist. So it's more of like some people ask for like abolishing police entirely. That could be a conversation we could have. But the first step could be actually, can we de-escalate the situation so that people are not harmed? Yeah. Maybe you donated some money in 2020. Maybe your parents sent some money to BLM organization because of white guilt. It's like, God, this is so wrong. I gotta send thousands of dollars. There was so much money being pouring into black organizations in 2020. Huge. And a lot of the ways that to places that were not legitimate. People were just so eager to spend money because they felt guilty about what was happening. And they felt like that is one thing they could do without really changing their lifestyle. But these monies were sometimes sent to places that were not actually affiliated with BLM. And there are issues of what they did with the money afterwards. So the founders of Black Lives Matter, there's a few of them, and they bought, I think, like $6 million mansion in Beverly Hills, and they were using it for parties and for supporting content creators to make videos. And there's a lot of like people angry about that. I'm not so worried about the BLM organization buying mansions in Beverly Hills. They could do whatever they want. But I think the key here is that that does not solve the problem. But the fact that we like to spend money to pretend that we are solving problem is the issue. What happened after 2022? The number of the people killed by police continues to grow. So we just have not solved the problem at all, right? So this is really the issue, is that people like to donate and do things or put some things on social media that does not fundamentally change the system that caused the problem in the first place. We need to get to this uncomfortable place of why are police killing people. So donations can't solve social problems. It's a quick remedy for the deep cuts in our society. If capitalism and current society works for you, why should you care? You know, if you're a white man, if you're a tech person, if your family is middle class, you're gonna have an okay life. You know, just statistically saying. Why would you care? Why would you care? If it works for you, why would you care? If the modularization works for you, you may choose to not care about the others. But you must understand the privileges that you have, your whiteness, your power, money, able body, may not be permanent. You may actually lose these privileges. And you see that happening across the different sectors. And I think that's just something that you need to understand, that the kind of life that your parents have had because of their whiteness and privileges may not be available for you. And you just cannot take that for granted. Because your privileges are contingent upon the social values of the current society. As society has changed, you may lose some of it. So don't take your, white male privilege for granted, and don't think that's going to get you easy pass all the time. And just fundamentally, I think it's just wrong to feel like, oh, it's okay, I'm a white person, I'm going to marry another white person, we're going to have a white family, we're going to live in mansions, and we're just not going to give a fuck. Good for you. Great life lived. Thank you very much. See you in hell. Sorry, that's generally how I feel. It's just, okay, enough with the negativity, the positive things. The only wealth you have is your time. This is the only thing that everybody has equally, is your time, your life. That's the only thing, and that actually is worth more than your whiteness or privilege or degree. Time, you have 70 years to live. Amazing, like time. And you also need to understand that the unsheltered people in Denver, the migrant workers, undocumented people, have the same wealth as you do, which is time. Social changes on their own are not inherently positive. So this idea of a change, what are you going to do to change? You're going to be a change maker. Change is not always positive. So computing plays a critical role in these changes, such as making filter bubbles, surveillance of attention economy, and AI in warfare. So I'm going to pivot to thinking about change and how tech and computing relates to this. Okay, so that was heavy. Can you pause a recording for a second? Just want to give you a moment to breathe. Well, I'm also indebted to you guys because you guys did so good work in your quizzes that I feel like you guys are real to me. I gotta be real to you. So that's just me being real. Okay. Computing plays a critical role in these changes, such as making filter bubbles, surveillance, attention economy, and AI. I'm gonna focus on attention economy and warfare. You heard that term before, attention economy, right? No? Okay, great word that I want to teach you. It treats human attention as a scarce commodity and applies economic theory to solve various information management problems. Essentially, it means that all of your click, all of your interaction on Instagram is a currency that they're trading. Let's say two apps that we spend the most time on, Canvas and Instagram. It's gonna get really funny. Okay, I had a lot of fun researching this. Okay, what the hell is Canvas? It's owned by Instructure, which is a public company, which is owned by Thoma Bravo, which is a private equity in Chicago that holds a lot of tech startups, especially cybersecurity. So Canvas, as a software, it lives on few servers, namely a server called Fastly, based in San Francisco. So it's just distributed around the different servers. But it's a software that we pay for as DU, most of the schools pay for. Canvas is a mini surveillance machine on students. It's used to collect their work and their attention span during class. You know that I could actually see how many minutes you spent on each assignment, right? So it's essentially, I can monitor your behavior. For the quizzes, I can see how much time you spent for each of the questions and total. So I can compare who spent the most time on this class just by looking at that. Essentially a surveillance machine. So privacy of Canvas is actually not great. Our data is their asset. It's traded to third party, and it will most likely be used to train AI models that's going to target advertising back to us. So there's another kind of NGO that monitors consumer privacy issue, and they did that, and Canvas actually shares a lot of information to third parties. By share, it means it sells. So when most of our academic learning activities take place in private domain, our knowledge production becomes private property. And I want to ask, like, what's the real cost of our attention and retention? So you probably did not know that they sell these data, right? But it knows who you are, it knows where you are, it knows what you do on Canvas, and that they could sell that to LinkedIn or Zillow.com or possibly Tinder, I don't know. But idea is that your time on Canvas, all the labor is theirs to be traded. Isn't that just messed up, right? It's just messed up. Like, why are we not questioning that? And DU actually requires us to use Canvas, so I can't just set up my own server and do it. Instagram collects 79% of user data and sells it to third parties. So all the things that you interact in Instagram, things you follow, unfollow, DMs, likes, that becomes the data set that could be used to target advertisement to you. So this question of attention economy has been around since Web 2.0, which is about 20 years old. But the new challenges or changes with AI is that our interactions are becoming tools for problems that don't exist yet. Does that make sense? So the way to think about AI is that it's an advanced statistics. It's not intelligence. It's just a very highly ornate statistics. And they're making AI without really the problems to solve, without problems. It's a solution for problems to exist. So it's our data becomes the potential for AI to solve, which is what kind of advertising to target at you. And I think that's a really big problem because you're going to spend a lot of time on computers in your life. Like, moment you graduate, you're going to look for jobs on Google Jobs. You're going to put your profile on LinkedIn, and you're going to look for apartment. You're going to look for mortgages. You're going to try to find a partner. And imagine that you live a happy 7 years from this point. Somebody's going to put a memorial of you on Facebook. Like, so our entire life is captured as asset to be traded. So what do we do? Divest, diversify our ecosystem from Instagram, X, Facebook. So those are application, but later it will be like Google Storage, Amazon Web Services, and other kinds of infrastructure. And this is something that I'm actively trying. It is hard, but it is possible, and I will show you some more examples on Wednesday. And I say this specifically to the engineering students in class who, I know you're very smart and skilled, and I want you to have a good job, but what is the definition of a good job? Is it Silicon Valley big tech? Is it advertising? Is it pharma? If you take those positions, always think about me. And just who's going to ask you, like, are you really sure this is a good job? Are you doing well? What are you doing with all of your talents and resources? I'll be happy if you get a job at Amazon because they need good people there. But the decisions that you make in those places could have impact around the world. So I'm not discouraging you from the big tech, but we need more principles. And this is specifically like from my experience at Princeton. I was a visitor there a few years ago, and I met amazing computer scientists, very brilliant, POC, first gen, kind of like the people that I'm really invested in. And they went to work for defense industry, making AI that's deployed in war zones. And I'm just like, God, like I wish you had more of ethics course, or maybe you had other options but to do that. But they justified in all sorts of ways, and I really fundamentally disagree. So divest and diversify. Problem is it is really the problem of the bigness of our society and our computing. Problem is the fast and how acceleration and efficiency is taken for granted. And problem is the constellation of money, power, and time. And I really want to revisit this idea of time as wealth and time as something that you have a full control of. Like you as an individual or anyone, we cannot really change who gets elected as a president of the US. Like we can't change what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but you have option to change how you think about your time, right? So the time is really powerful. And this kind of a surveillance and attention economy is really the key of understanding computing culture of today. And again, the problem is the consequentialism. The end justifies the means. The thinking that, yeah, these companies that are making defense technologies are also making monitoring tool to control or to keep track of the climate change, and it could save some whales. Yeah, but like at what cost? And we're witnessing these contemporary societies regressing back to the mid-century. And this is really the point that I want to get. And again, the war in Gaza is similar to war in Vietnam, and the social conditions are mirroring. So Vietnam was, the 20 years in the mid-century, and this war may go on for a long time. And I said this a few times, but I really want to make it clear. It's a U.S. war. It's a war of a U.S. military, industrial, and financial complexes taking place in Palestine. So just the arms that U.S. exports is far greater than Germany or Italy or other kinds of countries. So It's just essentially an American war, a proxy war that's happening. This is why I find it really urgent to talk and to do something about it. So the genocide machine of the German Nazi party in Auschwitz and other places, and the AI used by Israeli Defense Force, very uncomfortable comparison, but I want to get to here because it's really important to see how this relates to modularity. Probably the worst architecture ever built by human being is the concentration camp. It's a machine that was designed to kill people as efficiently as possible. Just horrid. And it's still jarring, the scale of these operations and the kinds of logic behind making concentration camp. I want to talk about the flow chart of the concentration camp, because they actually had a org chart and a flow chart of how they handle the Jewish people, the massacre of the Jewish people. So it starts from arrival. They sort people according to people who can walk, and those people who can walk basically go through a couple of processes of segregating by men and women, and also there's a selection that happens between person condemned for immediate death and person condemned to work. The person who's condemned to work go through extermination through work. So they work until they die. A literal hell. So if they're immediately condemned to death, they still have to surrender their valuables, surrender their clothing, and then either they get shot or their hair gets removed, gassing, and hair and gold filling removal, and cremation or burial. And this is just a floor plan of the architecture. And you just see that how, for a lot of people, this was just a practical operation. For a lot of people, this was just a job. And I compare this with the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Force. So this is just their organizational chart. Like, unarguably one of the most advanced, sophisticated military in the world, a state of the technology and efficiency. And they go through these levels of abstraction to individual units that are modularized. And I think this is where it gets really uncomfortable, this comparison between the concentration camp and AI. Anyone heard about like Gospel or Lavender? Okay, so Gospel is an AI that's used by IDF for automating decision making about where they're gonna attack. And I have a video. Hey. Yeah, so it's just, sorry I had to screen that. It's just really, really sad. But I want to put it in the historical context of the genocide that has happened 100 years ago in concentration camps and different kinds of decision-making processes that were delegated to low-ranking officials to execute large massacre of Jewish people. So AI is used to automate decision-making processes about who to kill. This is extreme modularization. And I want to bring Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher. Anyone know Hannah Arendt? Maybe some of you? Okay. So she is one of the leading scholars of the last century. She is a Jewish person. She went to the trial of Eichmann, who was one of the officials that killed the most Jewish people. And this trial was in Jerusalem many years after it actually happened. And this was kind of the trial of the century, because it was essentially bringing to the accountability of the massacre that has happened during the World War II. And Arendt says, I mean, Arendt basically says Eichmann is stupid, that he is very career-driven, egotistic person who was trying to please his boss more than anything else, that his decision and contribution to massacre was essentially self-centered. She says that such remoteness from reality and such thoughtlessness can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts that taken together, which perhaps are inherent in man. That was in fact the lesson one could learn from Jerusalem. Many people disagree with her. Many people think it's just not a stupidity of one person or the system. I think it's debatable, this analysis of this genocide. I think the core that I'm trying to get at is the price of modularity and the real cost of the segregation of decision-making processes. And because it's efficient, it allows people to not be accountable. So I think he was actually executed, but many people who were complicit in the system of genocide of the Jewish people were not. So we kind of like the person who killed George Floyd, like he's in prison, but everybody else is still there. So modularization works really well because you take one part of art out that does not work, but the rest of the system remains the same. So I think this is the point that I'm trying to get at. What is the end goal of this current genocide? When is this going to end? I don't know, but I think the Israeli government has a plan. And that is actually to build a smart city in Gaza. And this document was leaked only a week ago. And this very cheaply made AI rendering was actually used in the cabinets of the parliaments in Israeli leadership to say they're going to make an eco-friendly, sustainable, smart city that is a free trade zone in Gaza. And that's going to connect to other Arab nations around the region, and it's going to be a kind of a Hong Kong of the future. You know, Hong Kong was the free trade zone between China and the UK. This is the kind of the dream that fulfills the goal of many different states, including the Western states, but also Arab states. So they're sacrificing one particular region and their people for the interests of the free trade capitalism. So smart city is the next step of modularization, which I'm personally researching on, and I think we should look into carefully. And you might ask, like, where is this all going? Like, what is my position? And I'll just be really candid, is that ceasefire is not enough, because ceasefire leads to forever war, just like South Korea and North Korea. And that actually feeds into the military-industrial complex forever. So it's actually beneficial that ceasefire is the conclusion, not actually resolving the issue. So what is to be done? I think we need to rethink the idea of nation and citizenship. I think we need to rethink how we think about our citizenship and our nation. I think we need to dismantle military-industrial complex. I think it's just bad, and I think we should do it. Specifically for Palestine and Israel, if you ask, I support one state for all, and this is very simple. The two-state solution will lead to forever war, and radically rethinking what nationhood could be. It should be inclusive of the people who live in the region. So this idea of ethnocentric or religious-centric or language-specific citizenship is something of the past century. Like, United States is a very multicultural society. It could be for other places too. So making of the Israeli state was a solution to heal the historical genocide against the Jewish people. It was necessary at the time, but it's now enacting another genocide. So it's really crucial to see these global conflicts from diplomatic, environmental, cultural, technical, and ethical conditions that we are complicit in. So it's much more of our issue as an issue over in the Middle East. And I believe it's really crucial to think that everybody can and need to change. So this idea of change is that we are capable of change, other people are capable of change, and we should change and change for the better, as opposed to more regression to the pre-modern societies. That's my position. I just have 6 more slides, and finally, kind of leading on to Wednesday and the final writing is that I want to think about other futures of computing. I want to think about computing that is not war machines. I want to think about small computers. I want to think about, radically small, miniature, not only in like physical scale, but what it does. I want to think about slow internet. I want to think about communicating that is human and earthed, meaning like grounded on the earth, so not on the cloud, but a slow forms of communication. I want to think about old phones and laptops. Like you have laptops, that's gonna be old in few years. You're gonna need to get rid of it. And there's just not much you can do with old laptops right now, and it gets separated for parts. Very small part of the laptops are recycled. Most of it actually gets shipped to the third world country and either burned or buried in the ground. How can we change it? How can we think about my particular laptop making change? How can we repair that? I want to think about small revolution, because many of you said, oh, these social conditions and like wars are so big, I don't know what I can do because I'm nothing, I'm a small person. But I really think revolution needs to be small. Revolution is always successful when it's very, very small and personal. So the question for you in the final reading is like, what are you going to do about all of your relationship with climate change, racism, etc.? Don't think that you're going to be the diplomat for the UN tomorrow. Like, I don't think you are going to be fixing all these issues, but what are you going to do within the time that you have, the resources that you have? So this is very long, but I'm going to read it carefully. This is from Grace Lee Boggs, who was an activist based in Detroit. She's a Chinese-American person who was married and partnered to a black activist. So this is from her book called The New American Revolutionary for the 21st Century. She passed away a few years ago. But she talks about quantum, an idea of a change. She says, what the most advanced researchers and theoreticians in all sciences now comprehend is that the Newtonian concept of universe driven by mass force is out of touch with reality, for it fails to account for both observable phenomena and theoretical conundrums that can be explained only by quantum physics. A quantum view explains the success of small efforts quite differently. Acting locally allows us to be inside the movement and flow of the system, participating in all those complex events occurring simultaneously. We are more likely to be sensitive to the dynamics of the system and thus more effective. However, change in small places also affect the global system, not through incrementalism, but because every small system participates in unbroken wholeness. Activities in one part of the whole creates effects that appear in distant places. Because of these unseen connections, there is a potential value in working anywhere in the system. We never know how our small activities will affect others through the invisible fabric of our connectedness. In what Wheatley calls this exquisitely connected worlds, the real engine of change is never critical mass. Dramatic and systemic change always begins with critical connections. So by now, the crux of our preliminary needs should be apparent. We must open our hearts to new beacons of hope. We must expand our minds to the new modes of thought. We must equip our hands with new methods of organizing. And we must build on all of the humanity-stretching movements of the past half century. The Montgomery bus boycott, the civil rights movement, and the free speech movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, the Asian Americans, the Native Americans, Chicano movements, women's movements, the gay and lesbian movements, the disability rights and pride movement, and the ecological environmental justice movement. We must find ourselves amid the 50 million people who as activists or as supporters have engaged in the many sides of struggles to create the new democratic and life-affirming values that are in need of civilized US society. So in summary, she says, think small, think about what you can do, think about critical connections as opposed to critical mass, and you have your revolution. So, any thoughts or questions? Okay, so Nabil's talk is online. It's 40 minutes. You could also read it. He asks similar questions. I would like you to watch or read it before Wednesday class so that we could talk about it. On Wednesday, I'm going to show you more artistic examples, technical examples, some of the ways to address these. And I'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you.